Welcome to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada, and on podcast. I'm Paul Smith, host of Food Farm Talk. Today you'll hear another episode of Stories of Regeneration, a podcast series from Regeneration Canada, based in Montreal, and Rural Roots for Climate Solutions, based in Stettler, Alberta, with funding from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. We thank Regeneration Canada and Rural Roots for Climate Solutions for permission to air this episode. And this episode, Sharing the Land, features fifth generation farmer Rébeka Frazer-Chiasson and her farm, Ferme Terre Partagee in Rogersville, New Brunswick, which operates as a co-op. Enjoy.
Yeah, so we're outside of the town of Rogersville, which was once considered the Brussels sprouts capital of Canada. There was a lot of Brussels sprouts grown here.
Wow. I'm Derek Leahy, host of the Rural Roots to Climate Solutions podcast. During the growing season of 2023, a group of folks from Quebec, the West Coast, and the Prairies traveled to Canada and met with, shared a meal with, and laughed with farmers and ranchers who are practicing regenerative agriculture. One of the first stops was Rogersville, New Brunswick, which, unbeknownst to us at the time, it used to be the Brussels sprouts capital of Canada.
We're on this rural road called Pleasant Ridge, so it is a bit of a ridge. Where the farm is at is like the highest point in the region. It's not, super high, but you do have access to some of the nicest sunsets over the fields.
Most of us in this traveling band had never met before, and we worked for different organizations. One big thing we had in common was that we were determined to shine a big old spotlight on 10 farms and ranches that were regenerating the land and ecosystems while producing healthy and nutritious food. We also got to take in some pretty amazing sunsets too. In the case of the poor film crew, they had to take in some pretty amazing sunrises. Thank God the golden hour isn't a thing in podcasting.
And we're on a couple different properties. We have this one main piece of land that we use for growing vegetables and where we have our packing warehouse and the farmhouse that's a collective space for the kitchen, lunches, bathroom, as well as hosting woofers on the farm, which stands for Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. So we do have travelers from all over the world that come and stay for a couple of weeks or sometimes a month and help out in exchange for a place to live and food and some kind of cultural exchange.
Through farm-to-table dinners, videos, webinars, articles, and this podcast series, we captured what we saw and heard during our travels in the hopes of making regenerative agriculture principles and practices more accessible to the public, making them something that anyone who eats can understand and appreciate.
So that's our main piece of property, which is about 11 acres of either vegetables or cover crops, and another about 25 acres in hay, and then the rest, because it's on 100 acres, is woodlot. But we have access to many other fields that my dad owns, and we have another small part of the farm about 500 meters down the road where we have our greenhouse that's connected to a wood heating source furnace. That's why it's not in the same area. And the pig barn and a place where we keep our pastured chickens, where we pull their coop and move the fence on pasture. Another 2 kilometers down the other side where we have our beef cows on pasture. And I guess the reason that we're a little bit spread out is that across generations, people would set up close but not right next to their parents, I guess, but it's still all connected but a little bit distinct, I guess. One where the beef cows are, that was my grandparents' house, that is now the house of my colleague Pierre Olivier. Okay. And where the pig barn is and the silos and the grain mill and the greenhouse and the chickens, that's close to where my dad lives. And then the main farmhouse is where Kevin and I used to live, but has now become bought by the co-op to be used as a collective space. So that's why we're a bit spread out, but it does have some advantages, and we have access to a lot of land compared to maybe that can be a challenge for many farms, and especially new farms and new farmers. My name is Rébeka Frazer-Chiasson. I live on Pleasant Ridge outside of the small town of Rogersville between Miramichi and Moncton in New Brunswick. And I'm a farmer at la cooperative Ferme Terre Partagee.
Rural Roots to Climate Solutions, in partnership with Regeneration Canada, presents Stories of Regeneration, a podcast series exploring why we, as a society, need to get behind the farmers and ranchers who are regenerating the land, ecosystems, and local economies through their agricultural practices and principles. Farmers and ranchers who are striving for great things through regenerative agriculture. Part 4, Sharing the Land, with Rébeka Frazer-Chiasson of Ferme Terre Partagee in Rogersville, New Brunswick, July 19th, 2023.
I feel like every time I ask this question, people are really stretching their memory, but can you remember the first time you heard about Regen Ag?
Yeah, no, not necessarily. I think maybe it was one of the first times it was a National Farmers Union board meeting. I'm involved with the NFU in New Brunswick.
Oh, cool.
Someone was talking about regenerative agriculture as like not necessarily a new concept, but just the putting a word to a set of principles and their interest in it and maybe the principles. And that was probably 10 or so years ago.
Okay.
It didn't, I think I remember that it kind of struck me as like, that's just like a normal, like that's just what we all do, kind of like
Right.
Not necessarily like, oh, that's something that we have to like look into to see if we could do more. Not saying it by any means that we're like ticking all the boxes or like have attained all the principles in any way, but it does sometimes feel like there's a lot of the same words, or sorry, different words to sort of get at the same things. But I understand that organics has not necessarily taken a turn, but sort of means something that's more certifiable and commercial and can look like very different depending on scale or whatever. So, and doesn't necessarily touch on as many principles as regenerative agriculture, I guess.
Regenerative agriculture doesn't have one definition and one definition alone that everyone agrees on. Aside from that broad definition or foundational concept that Regen Ag is about leaving the land better off than we found it. Just to give you an idea, I'm going to throw out a handful of definitions for regenerative agriculture from different organizations without naming names. Definition number 1, a way of farming that focuses on soil health. Definition number 2, farming and grazing practices that, among other benefits, reverse climate change by building soil organic matter and restoring degraded soil biodiversity, resulting in both carbon drawdown and improving the water cycle. Definition 3, an outcomes-based food production system that nurtures and restores soil health, protects the climate and water resources and biodiversity, and enhances farms' productivity and profitability. Definition number 4, a systems-based, holistic look at the land being stewarded and applies various principles with the goal of making the land more productive and biodiverse over time. And definition number 5, a set of principles and practices which reverse current trends of degradation in soil, water, and air quality by enhancing the soil ecosystem and restoring its biology. That last one was actually from our friends at Regeneration Canada. You should head over to their website if you want access to just a ton of resources on regenerative agriculture in Canada. I'm sure you noticed through those definitions that they have a lot in common. But like I said, there isn't really one agreed upon definition for regenerative agriculture, and maybe that's not a bad thing. Rébeka just mentioned that for her, regen ag is just farming. Blake Vince, so the grain farmer we heard from in part 3 of this series, he said he wasn't really into labels when we talked about his practices, but he's definitely farming regeneratively. Rachel Lightfoot, an agriculture producer in Nova Scotia that we're going to hear from in this series very shortly, she farms biodynamically, which is an agriculture system that has a lot in common with regen ag. The regenerative agriculture tent, if you will, it's pretty big. It has lots of room for a diversity of agriculture producers using a diversity of practices and who are at different stages of their regenerative journey. Even if they aren't explicitly using the term regenerative agriculture when they're talking about their farm or ranch. It's the principles behind regenerative agriculture that are pretty cut and dry. Principles like understanding the context or minimizing soil disturbance don't leave a heck of a lot of room for interpretation. They do leave a lot of room for application because by design, regenerative agriculture principles are meant to be applied in a way that makes sense for the context an agriculture producer is farming or ranching in. The Stories of Regeneration series is going to cover 10 regenerative agriculture principles. Why 10? Because when you do an internet search for regenerative agriculture principles, you're likely only to come across 5, maybe 6 principles. Regeneration Canada, so our partner in this series, and the organization that created and led the overall Stories of Regeneration project. They added 4 more principles to reflect the fact that the services regenerative agriculture practices provide have a positive impact that extends beyond the farm or ranch. Those practices have implications for entire communities, watersheds, and ecosystems. So for those of you who are familiar with the 6 principles of regenerative agriculture, here's the 4 additional ones we're going to explore through the series. Reciprocity within both nature and human ecosystems, safeguarding water cycles, preserving and restoring natural ecosystems, and prioritizing social justice, food sovereignty, and economic viability. All right, let's get back to our conversation with Rébeka and how she got into agriculture, then out of agriculture, then back into agriculture.
I grew up on this farm, but it was never really seen as or shared as like a viable option for a career, especially financially, I think. And I didn't really probably show like a super keen interest in agriculture, although I did have an interest for everything that is social justice, and that's what I ended up studying at university. And a lot of those like reflections brought me back to the farm. Questions about food sovereignty and access to food and globalization. When I finished the degree, it wasn't necessarily with like a clear path to farming that I came back, but it was just like to do something more hands-on, less academic. So I started a small organic strawberry U-pick with my dad, which was like something that we hadn't done on the farm before. And then it became like another little project, raising chickens, and another project of selling seedlings. And then eventually when it came to starting a CSA, that's where I left the job that I had at the time to farm full time.
Were you like one of those farm kids that couldn't get out of here quicker? I find a lot of the ones I met in Alberta, by the time they turned 18, they just got out of town, yeah.
No, I appreciated for sure my life on the farm, but we weren't very pushed to help out. Like we did have sometimes pressure just as part of like as someone who eats or as someone who contributes to this family, you have to do some things, but we definitely didn't have like chores every day. I was in a lot of like extracurricular activities, and that was fine and encouraged, and not, you can't do that because you have these farm responsibilities. So I appreciated it, my growing up on the farm, but I wasn't integral to the operation in any way, And it wasn't seen like as something that I might do in the future. So I think that's why when I started reading about or thinking about, like, my degree was called Justice and Globalization, and there was a lot of things that, like, theoretically I felt like connected to the farm, that I had connections that I hadn't made, and also practically realizing just like, oh, there's a lot of hard skills that I could have learned that I don't have right now, and but that I still can learn. When I did come back to farm, I always knew, and that was one of the reasons that I never really saw farming as like a viable career, was obviously the financial side of things, as I was mentioning, but I also saw my dad working so alone all the time, and I just wasn't interested, and also didn't feel like I had the capacity, both just like mental but also like skill wise. So that was part of the reason or the attraction of a co-op. And I think it's part of the attraction as well of direct marketing, just knowing the people that are eating your food, knowing who you're doing this for, as well as hosting and sharing. It can get a bit lonely or monotonous doing repetitive work, and work that seems endless sometimes, but when you have some moments of sharing and collective work and those kinds of things, I think that it's a good change. So we grow vegetables, and most of them are sold through a CSA. We have 125 to 150 CSA members. We sell especially in Moncton, which is like an hour and some away, but also in Bathurst, more north of New Brunswick, and obviously in Rogersville at the farm as well. And we go to 2 different farmers markets, in Beresford, which is near Bathurst, and Dieppe, which is near Moncton. We also raise some animals. So the co-op technically has laying hens and chickens and turkeys. And then, as I was mentioning, with our producer members, we also sell lamb, beef, and pork through the co-op. And we also do some cover crops on some of our fields, and both our producer members and we participate to some extent in haying and grain production for the animals as well.
Rébeka's family has been farming in the region since 1886, making her a 5th-generation farmer, one of the few featured in the Stories of Regeneration series. Most of the agriculture producers we interviewed for the series were somewhere around being a 3rd-generation agriculture producer. Her family has been involved in a lot of different types of agriculture production, like Brussels sprouts and dairy, over the years. And in 2018, a cooperative was created on her family's land. If you're like me, and you've heard of co-ops before, but you really couldn't explain to someone how it's different from a corporation owned by shareholders, a key difference is how decisions are made, i.e. voting rights. In a co-op, if you're a member of a co-op, you're entitled to 1 vote when decisions need to be made. So 1 member, 1 vote. With shareholders, your voting rights are based on the amount of shares you own.
We became certified organic just in 2012, but a lot of that history would have been still some forms of organic agriculture, and they've been raising animals for sure throughout that whole 100+ years. And in 2018 we became a workers' co-op, but before that time the idea had already been going around, circulating. Even when it was just myself and my dad, we sort of like naively were like writing letters to agricultural colleges saying, hey, we're here and we have access to land and some machinery and some knowledge, and we know that those things can be difficult to find for new entrants, and let's talk about what that could look like, kind of thing. And in 2014 is when my now partner Kevin came to the farm and was an aspiring farmer even then, and we continued with the idea of the co-op, but launched the CSA, or I had started that same year, and then he jumped in. And we felt like before we could really become a co-op, we'd at least have to have some enterprise going on already and some idea of what that could look like or what diversification projects could happen. And Pierre-Olivier found us. He was already part of a co-op in Saguenay that was disbanding, that was also a workers' co-op, and he was looking for somewhere else to farm, and specifically farm cooperatively. And he was interested in leaving Quebec, where he felt like rules around agriculture were very, very strict, and there wasn't a lot of possibility in terms of a very diversified farm. And so he came in 2017, and then we did kind of a trial year, and in 2018 we incorporated. So that was 5 years ago. We're still the same members, although there's a lot of other people that have added or been tacked on to what we kind of call the Ferme Terre Partagee community. So not officially members of the co-op, but Phil has been working at the farm for 5 years now, and he and his partner Jen and their 2 and soon to be 3 kids are pretty central to the whole operation. Marvin and Lisa emigrated from France, specifically to Rogersville. And Marvin actually came as a woofer a couple of times before. That's how we met. So there's some people that are getting grafted onto the project, although we don't have yet new members, but that continues to be an objective in terms of future projects. We'd like to be maybe 10 members or 10 families that are supported by the co-op and that support the co-op, and vice versa. That would involve a lot of diversification in terms of projects, both potentially farming and connected to farming, but not necessarily. So whether that's summer camps or other forms of hosting that we were talking about, or more value-added stuff, or obviously some other forms of production that we're either not doing or that we could do more of, or that we could do better. But another opportunity or challenge, it could be both, of a co-op is that things have to be pretty set out and structured, because it's not just one person or one family that is calling the shots and making decisions. And I think that it has to be clear what the advantages are of being a member, or what the differences are between being a member, being an employee, being a volunteer. There's a salary, but as we mentioned in the beginning, it's not very high. So how can we get that to be higher? But also how can we build some advantages into being a member that are maybe not only based on salary? So those are all things that we have to keep working on in hopes of finding or attracting new members, and just even for the people that are there, in hopes of clarifying and just giving the space for people to be their best selves or whatever.
Yeah, that's the problem with people. They're individuals sometimes.
Yes, like balancing between the individual and the collective and the co-op, allowing enough autonomy and freedom, but also having standards and ways that are, set so that everyone knows what to expect and what's expected of them.
Which that leads actually really nicely into the next question about what led to the decision to create a co-op in 2018. Like there's some great things about co-ops, and there's also some things that I'm sure can hinder the operation, because you got I know a lot of people have a say in what's happening on the land that you grew up on. There's all these bylaws you got to adhere to. So what made you decide to pull the trigger on that one?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, for me originally, it was just well, I know I don't want to farm on my own, and feel like I have some advantages like access to land and machinery and mentorship or knowledge in the form of my dad and my aunt and uncle and some other people around that I'd like to share with other people if there was openness or desire for that. And I know I don't have the skills the all around skills to be a farmer or on my own. So what are, one of the advantages of having multiple people would be that we all bring a different skill set to the table. So those were all some of the reasons or advantages. I think a lot of us, like Pierre Olivier was already a member of a co-op before, and he for sure, and a lot of us don't necessarily see each other as see ourselves, as bosses or and obviously we have to have our own maybe areas of expertise or areas that we manage, but we don't feel comfortable being the person that calls all the shots or takes decisions without necessarily consulting. Not that you can, not all sole proprietorship type businesses are like that, or that it's very top down, but the intention is to have a more horizontally integrated operation.
Is there 3 different agriculture enterprises here? Your dad's the cooperative and your own, or is it all one?
No, the co-op is one, and there's 4 founding members who are still the same. Myself, my husband Kevin, my dad, and my partner Pierre Olivier. But my dad also continues. He was running his farm operation a long time before we became co-op Ferme Terre Partagee, and he continues raising beef cattle and pigs. And my aunt and uncle, who are a little bit down the road, they are also producer members of the co-op, so not the 4 founding members are worker members. So they produce lamb, and that is sold through the co-op. We're pretty strict in our criteria of who can be a producer member, in the sense that you have to live on Pleasant Ridge. We have to know each other and have a sense that we know the product that we're selling. So in the case of their operation, we help with shearing and we help with haying, and they help us a ton with mechanics and with deliveries. So we're really close. We're not like a marketing co-op where we would sell products from any other farm anywhere else. We're a worker co-op, so we have to feel like everyone is helping to produce what we sell and knows what we sell.
I mentioned in part 2 of our series with the Axtons of Minton, Saskatchewan, that the first 3 farms we visited for the Stories of Regeneration project all seemed to be doing something to regenerate economic opportunities in their communities. And they were all doing this through the ways they'd chosen to operate their farms. I was actually so inspired by this, I wrote an article called Regenerating Rural Opportunities that you can find on the Rural Roots to Climate Solutions website. Rébeka has almost taken it one step further by sharing the land with people who probably could never afford to purchase farmland themselves. People like me. For people looking to get into agriculture, not being able to afford the high price of agriculture land and a lack of agriculture knowledge tend to be 2 of the biggest barriers they face. And in a way, Rébeka has found a way to address this by sharing what she has and through the co-op. And for Rébeka, she has the benefit of not having to farm alone because, let's face it, farming or ranching can be lonely sometimes. Don't get me wrong, that solitude can be nice for sure. But when things start going wrong, like they did during the growing season of 2023, knowing that you don't have to problem solve entirely on your own can help take off some of the pressure. Rébeka mentioned something in there called a CSA, or Community Supported Agriculture. It's a type of direct marketing where consumers pay for a growing season's worth of vegetables up front, usually in the spring, and they get what they get depending on how good or poor a season is. In this way, the producer and consumer are sharing the risk or bounty of a given growing season, as opposed to the farmer hoping that people buy their stuff when they go to the farmer's market. The downside of a CSA or any kind of direct marketing is that they can be a lot of work because you've just created a whole new farm job, marketing. I know some agriculture producers who are brilliant at marketing, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say Most agriculture producers didn't get into agriculture because they really liked the hustle product. Plus, the retention rates for CSAs really fluctuate. You can lose half of your CSA members after just 1 year. So I asked Rébeka, why not sell to one of the big grocery store chains?
The reason for, I think some of us or most of us for growing or growing organically or growing regeneratively is that we're growing what we would like to eat. I don't think any of us would be interested in putting the amount of pesticides or fertilizer or mechanical inputs, although we do use, obviously, we're not against mechanization, but that would be needed to grow certain crops with certain standards. I think we'd be not too keen on the amount that we'd have to throw away also, because it's not like perfect according to whatever standards. So partly the idea of like growing what we would like to eat and then sharing that with other people, I think comes naturally through the CSA. But yes, it is a lot of work because there's almost two businesses involved. There's the business of growing, and then there's the business of selling and all of the customer relations that comes with it, and writing newsletters, and just dealing with people that can't come and pick up at whatever time and need to switch, and it's all work that we easily forget because we like it or we see value in it, and we see talking to people is especially for the most part people who are really appreciative of what we do, gives it a lot of value. So sometimes we forget that that is a lot of work.
But the support an agriculture producer can get from CSA members can sure come in handy during a rough growing season like the one in 2023. Remember, that was the spring and summer Canada got hit by wildfires in the west and in the east, drought and floods. When I was talking with Rébeka, it was around mid-June, and that was just a couple of weeks after it was declared that Quebec had no more out-of-controlled wildfires. And it was also just before a state of emergency was declared in Nova Scotia because of flash flooding. I remember driving from Rogersville to Halifax so I could catch my flight back to Alberta. And that was just a couple days before the state of emergency was declared in Nova Scotia. And I had to drive so slow because of all the rain. The exact same thing actually happened to me when I was traveling from interior BC to Vancouver in October after recording one of the 2 BC episodes for this series. So maybe it's just me. If only I could make it rain like that in the prairies.
Yeah, the Maritimes and part of Quebec have been dealing with maybe everywhere has been dealing with a really difficult season, but just for different reasons. In our case, it's a lot of water, a lot of rain, and some pretty cold temperatures in June, and then some not a lot of heat in July, but at least a little bit warmer, but still not a lot of sun. A lot of rain makes it difficult for many reasons, for things that are direct seeded, like carrots and beets and many other crops. Some of the time it was like seeded and then just like a huge downpour where that there's considerable washing away of the seeds that have just been planted. It also makes it hard if you're working with machines and tractors, because you can't go in the fields when they're too wet, and you can't work the soil when it's too wet. It just becomes like completely baked afterwards and really hard. That's been a challenge for everything, but especially weeding. Sometimes we're like weeding in the pouring rain. When you weed, usually with implements, whether they're mechanic or hand tools, the intent is to expose the roots of the weeds to the sun. So clearly that's not happening. So the best we could do is just weed by hand and throw the weeds into the pathways. So that's kind of some firsts. Like, we have to weed because the weeds are growing faster than anything else, but we're doing it in the pouring rain. So we always struggle with weed control, but this year is particularly difficult, and I know that it's difficult for everyone. Yeah, it's not been an easy year for sure. We're probably like 3 weeks behind in terms of like what's in our CSA at this time and what we're getting into the ground. We're like really, according to our planting calendar, we are about 3 weeks behind. Now, most of what has needed to be sown has been sown, so we're not behind in that way, but we know that there's going to be a challenge once fall comes around as well, because we have maybe 30 or 40% of our squash that actually germinated and the rest of the seed that just rotted in the ground. A lot of the warmer crops like tomatoes and eggplants and peppers and zucchinis were kind of lagging a lot from missing sun, but that in the last week or two we've seen a lot of growth, so we're thinking that that's gonna pick up. It'll just be a bit later, probably a good 2 weeks still, but yeah, we'll try to adapt in the fall and grow more greens and try to make up for some of the crops that didn't do so well germination wise, that will still come to fruition, I think, but just not in the quantities that we were hoping. There's still time, and the falls have been warm for the last number of years, so we'll see what that looks like. We generally have some pretty understanding CSA partners, and we, especially the people that have been there for years, know that they have received a lot in the last years. Like when we've had good crops of whatever, they were always the first recipients. So I think because of that, they're extra understanding, but this year we're thinking it'll probably be, they're not going to get less than what they paid for sure, but they might not, compared to other years, get the abundance that we had before.
Right. No, fair enough. And did you also I was just in Nova Scotia the other day, and they were saying at the start of the growing season that things were unusually dry. Did you have that as well, or was it just wet?
We had just like one very short dry period where we had to irrigate, and we almost lost a crop of kohlrabi because just it was transplanted like right in like 2 or 3 day heat wave, and a lot of the brassicas we cover with a floating row cover to help protect against insects, but it can add a couple degrees heat, and so we actually were able to save that, but by replanting some of the ones that died. And since then we've had like zero need to irrigate at all, so we haven't had too much dry this year.
Maintaining biodiversity is one of the 10 principles of regenerative agriculture that this series explores. If you remember from parts 1, 2, and 3 of the series, nature provides the blueprint in regenerative agriculture. And systems with greater diversity of soil organisms, plants, and animals are more resilient. They tend to have superior soil fertility and respond better to stresses such as diseases, climatic extremes, human impacts, and degradation. Practices like crop rotation, integration of pollinator buffers, elimination of chemical controls like pesticides, and mixing crops and livestock are all beneficial, and all things that Rébeka does on her farm to varying degrees. In fact, the name of the farm has a strong connection to biodiversity. It's also where we got the name for this episode.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point of saying like we're all part of biodiversity and all part of an ecosystem. It is, I think, yeah, when we think about biodiversity, we probably think of like untouched, which is definitely not a farm. But if it means a mix of and space for different species, then that's definitely always been the intention for this farm. And the name Ferme Terre Partagee comes from the idea that it was shared among generations, but also that it was shared and continues to be shared with different species that use this land, as well as different humans that have, even before, obviously, the Chiasson family. So there's a desire to recognize what's in the earth and what walks on the earth, and whether that's through the fields and sometimes when we don't want it to, or through the woods. And also the idea of wanting a mix of productions, so not just being focused on, even within our vegetable production, there's like 40 different crops, but also the importance and role of cover crops and of hay fields and of grain, and the place for animals, the benefits that they bring with the access to manure, and the kind of closed loop that we're going for of being able to feed animals with crops grown on our farm and using manure from the animals back onto the fields.
What are actually like some of the challenges of doing the closed loop system?
Well, I wouldn't say that our system is like a fully closed loop,
Loop?
that continues to be the intention or the hope. Growing grain is pretty challenging and requires some pretty specific machinery that is often costly and challenging to access and repair. Sometimes I've heard farmers say, like, I would prefer to buy grain and let other farmers lose money.
Well,
Yeah, I guess anything with animals, like we've seen not enough and not sustained enough, but a bit of a rise in small scale vegetable growing, a number of farms, and that's great. But I think it's because it's not necessarily because everyone's so passionate about vegetables. It's just that that's the most accessible, I think, form of agriculture. But we definitely need people to raise animals, and just maybe because it requires more machinery and, I don't know, maybe more dealing with death and shit and stuff that's less attractive.
Often when we think about diversity in ecosystems, we tend to think of places where humans don't live. Places like conservation areas or national parks. But in a city like the one I stayed in when I was in New Brunswick, so Moncton is part of an ecosystem. We as human beings are part of biodiversity. And the agricultural products we produce, from the smallest strawberry to the biggest cow, contribute to both. A closed-loop system in agriculture is when the nutrients that are created on farm are fed back into the farm, usually after living organisms have processed or consumed those nutrients. A cow grazing, for example, a cow grazing pasture adds nutrients back into that pasture through its manure and urine. Darren Qualman of the National Farmers Union does a really great job of explaining in episode 37 of our podcast how with the introduction of fossil fuels, we broke that loop apart. And all of a sudden, agriculture was dependent on external inputs more so than ever, external inputs that weren't being produced on farm, like fuels and synthetic fertilizers. In many ways, regenerative agriculture works to close that loop back up again, primarily by building up soil function so the land is less reliant on external inputs when it comes to producing food. Like agriculture producer Derek Leahy said in part 2 of Stories of Regeneration, we may not actually realize the potential of our soils if we just get out of the way.
So that's something that we try to do. I was listening to a podcast about regenerative agriculture, a farm in Quebec, and they were saying how you should put as much time and money and effort into your cover crops as you do into your cash crops. And I was like, yeah, we're not there. But I do see the value of that. But that's also the principle that maybe we'll get into of understanding context and whether the those constraints are financial or human or whatever. It seems like there's always lots of them. But we do have access to some seeding and disking and harrowing, larger scale machines than maybe some other small scale vegetable operations. So because of that, we're able to do many acres, and we've often done buckwheat as cover crop, but also weed suppression because it grows so fast, and we do have a lot of issues with weeds, so we use that, and then it just gets disked back into the field. We've done also either a winter wheat or a winter rye that we seed in the fall to just leave the ground covered over winter, and then disk before putting in our summer crops. Sometimes, like this year, it's done too well, and then we have it in our rows of carrots and in our garlic. Yeah. And we're doing some other rye to harvest as grain and as straw because it grows really, really well and really fast, and sometimes is used as a cover crop with a lot of density and health in the plants. And there's some other things that are not necessarily farming related, like I mentioned woodlot and just responsible wood harvesting, and in a lot of the woodlots it's no wood harvesting, but my dad does use wood for heating the barn, and we heat our greenhouse with wood as well, and lots of building materials that are milled on the farm. And we try, some of us are more naturalist than others, and better at recognizing what animals we have that we're cohabiting with. But all of us are very interested. Just some people, like my mom, is like super knowledgeable. So a couple of days ago or weeks now, we found a nest in the strawberries, which with 2 eggs and 2 hatchlings that we just took a photo of and then left. And I think, according to her, they were bobolink, which is like I'm not sure if it's endangered, but it's like a small bird that often nests in hay fields, so it can be more at risk, obviously, from like machinery and being hayed. So when we do have the opportunity to recognize and then just protect birds or other species, we try to take the opportunity, like in that case. Or last year we took down a barn on the farm that had a lot of swallows nests. And so I knew that and swallows are really beautiful, but also really practical for getting rid of mosquitoes. And I knew that they would probably be coming back and looking for those nests. And so we built 4 or 5 like swallow houses or whatever that we tacked onto another old shed. And those tree swallows have come back there, and the barn swallows have actually started nesting in that other shed that we like leave the door and the windows. It's like very old, so open, and they can come and go as they please. So yeah, we just try to recognize what other species are around. Still try to protect sometimes from them, like raccoons in the corn and bears in the grain field and stuff like that.
Sounds like this is really moose country out this way. That's just, they must wreak havoc when they walk through a field.
Well, you hear a lot about farms that have a lot of deer issues, and that even have to put up like very expensive deer fences.
Oh, shoot.
You don't hear so much about moose getting into fields. I'm not sure why, because we see them in the woods, we see them in the field sometimes at like close to the woods, but we haven't experienced, and I haven't heard from people saying that like moose have come in and like eaten all their crop of cabbage, but you do for deer. So plus they say that like moose and deer don't so much cohabitate, and like it's either moose country or deer country, and here it is more moose, although we're seeing more deer. I've never seen deer growing up here, and then in the last years we've seen some. So I don't know if that's changing or they're just living together more or...
That is interesting. So that's actually a really good point that like working with biodiversity can actually be a bit of a pain in the ass sometimes too. Like it gets in the way of production and can ruin production in some cases too.
For sure. Yeah. Like the farm is a very controlled biodiversity. So there's some species that you clearly favor over others, whereas the woods or some fields that are more left fallow or some areas of the farm are more whatever grows and profits. You can't say that in English. Profit. The best is fine. But yeah, just I guess personally also we just try to like explore the land. This year has been like such a rainy year, so I know that there's a lot of mushrooms around and hoping to get out to pick some chanterelles.
Nice.
At them. I was thinking even today maybe we could put some in our CSA basket for people that wanted it, just because it's good representation of the season.
So yeah, nobody said working with biodiversity doesn't have its challenges. But by building up and working with biodiversity, it is a great way to hedge your bets no matter what kind of growing season Mother Nature or the financial markets throw at an agriculture producer. As Rébeka mentioned, because it had been so wet in the summer, there was a possibility of adding chanterelle mushrooms to our CSA baskets. A little later in the series, we'll hear from Aaron Goodard of Snowy Mountain Farm in Coston, British Columbia, about how on-farm or on-ranch diversity is a great way to increase on-farm or on-ranch resiliency.
Yeah, like I said, it's kind of controlled biodiversity in the farm, or at least certain areas of the farm, but it doesn't mean that you can't appreciate or benefit from, even weeds, whether it's clover in the carrots, or as long as the carrots are able to get a bit ahead of it, there's a lot of benefit to that nitrogen fixing weed.
And with your cover crops, you're planting it where you plan on putting in vegetables, or is it more for your grain fields?
Yeah, often it's preceding vegetables.
Okay.
Sometimes also smaller quantities, like in a bed of vegetables once it's been harvested.
Okay.
We do reuse beds usually twice, not all of them, but depending on when the crop is harvested. If it's something that is harvested like now, it could be reused again for a different crop family in the fall.
Okay.
But if it's not going to be used, then sometimes we'll put like a peas and oats, or just by seeding by hand in that field, just so that in that bed, just so that it's covered.
Okay.
But larger sections of cover crops are usually preceding vegetables. Okay. Or strawberries. Or we haven't been grazing or integrating animals right into the fields. It's usually transporting manure onto the fields. Yeah, that's something that we've been doing for many years now, is using a wildflower, it's called bee feed mix, like a pollinator mix that blooms really impressively throughout the season. Like, it's really well put together to include things that are super fast growing and fast bloom within a couple of weeks of being seeded to like way until after frost. So with just one planting, we can have blooms for the whole many months. And it's also really beautiful, which is nice. When we had our event on farm with Regen Canada this year, I was telling people, I'm sure you're disappointed because the photo that we had last year was of the barn and this like really nice pollinator mix that was all in poppy flowers. Oh, wow. And it was so nice. We had people stopping and taking pictures, and this year we just couldn't get it seeded. So it's the first year that we haven't planted it, but we will again we had a couple of plans for, we also wanted to try seeding buckwheat in the pathways between we use landscape fabric on our brassicas and onions, and so that's all covered, but our pathways are often left open, and we are just weeding either with like a wheel hoe or just manual tools because it's too tight to get the tractor between the landscape fabrics. So we were hoping to try to seed buckwheat and then just like weed whack it or whatever, but that didn't happen either. And now it's like either super hard pack or literally like puddles still. So
what's the benefits for your farm to support biodiversity?
Depends on the practice, I guess, but when we were talking about the pollinator mix, like it's beautiful and nice to help bees, but bees mostly help us. So it also means that there's better pollination in our vegetable crops and potentially better production. There's a clear benefit right there in terms of like using the manure from the animals that we have on the farm. There's also a clear benefit. I think that it's more work and I'm sure more costly than it would be using like a synthetic fertilizer, but it's also about growing the food that we feel we would like to eat and that we feel is safe and contributes to community and environmental and health. So sometimes a lot of the benefits are not necessarily measurable. I mean, like having swallows on the farm, we think is probably helps with less mosquitoes.
The mosquitoes out here are horrible, so that must help with mental health.
Yeah, exactly. And it's probably helps with mental health just to see them like swooping around, which is really nice. Same with pasture, I guess, just more work maybe to move animals to newer pasture, but at the same time they're eating and growing and keeping the soil healthy and growing from healthy soils, so it's definitely still more beneficial than like either growing grain or buying grain to feed animals. I mean, clearly there's still animals that need grain, but ruminants that can be on pasture and can contribute to the soil's health while getting the soil to contribute to their health.
One thing about the biodiversity I wanted to ask too, the fact that you have this controlled biodiversity with like different livestock, different vegetables, is that also like a good way to diversify like revenue and sort of can help a little bit with financial security? Because if you're just doing one thing and that year doesn't like the wet, you're kind of screwed unless you get crop insurance or something like that.
That's a good point. Like we need it for something like a CSA where you're trying to offer folks like a diversity of crops and, you know, not the same 10 vegetables for 18 weeks in a row, but you also can benefit from it, like you said, in different years. I mean, I don't think there's going to be a season where all 40 vegetables do well, although there's some where more of them do well than this year, for example. But all the brassicas are looking really good. We can't say what insects will get into them later, but for now they like the wet and they like the cold, and they so they're growing well. Even in June when the temperatures were pretty worrisome for things like tomatoes, they don't care. So it's looking like a good year for broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage and all those things. And same for like a year where 3 years ago was like super dry and hot, and the corn did pretty well, and we had a good year of potatoes because it was too hot for potato bugs, which is rare around here. So yeah, there's always something sometimes it's not the crops that you would like, or it's the less popular or whatever, but there's always something you can depend on.
I am a bit overzealous about growing potatoes, as people who know me and people who listen to episode 36, Regenerative Potatoes, very well know. By the way, growing potatoes regeneratively is pretty challenging. We learned in part 3 with Ontario farmer Blake Vince, minimizing soil disturbance is one of the principles of regenerative agriculture. Potatoes don't just pop out of the ground when they're ready to be harvested. You have to dig them out, which honestly, in my opinion, is part of the fun. Generally, growing a market garden or a diversity of vegetables regeneratively is challenging. Some of the standard regenerative agriculture practices, like minimizing soil disturbance, keeping the soil covered, maintaining living roots year-round, they're doable in a beef operation, or even if you're growing grains, but they're not so easy with a diversity of veggies because of weed pressure and the amount of plant that needs to be harvested come harvest time. For example, with root vegetables, you can't really leave the root in the ground year round because that root is literally the thing you want to eat or sell. So I find it really impressive that veggie producers like Rébeka can still pull it off and apply regenerative agriculture principles on their farm. Again, it's that understanding the context of your farmer ranch principle that really helps out here, because it allows her and others to apply those principles in a way that makes sense for her farm. Meaning she doesn't have to sacrifice profitability for all those lovely social and environmental outcomes that go along with regen ag, some of which we've covered in this series already, like reducing the carbon footprint of agriculture, keeping watersheds healthy, and creating rural economic opportunities. I hope I'm not making it sound like following regenerative agriculture principles if you're a veggie grower is impossible, because that's definitely not the case. If you go to the farmer's blog on the Rural Roots to Climate Solutions website, you can read about a veggie farmer from Red Deer, Alberta, so Mike Kozlowski, who a few years back was experimenting with no-till, so what Blake Vince was doing in part 3 with his grains. But in Mike's case, he was doing no-till veggie production. There's even that concept of alley cropping, where you grow a crop between rows of fruit trees, nut trees, just plain old wonderful trees, and that crop could potentially be vegetables. A Wisconsin agriculture producer named Mark Shepard was growing asparagus with his alley cropping system. We talk about alley cropping in episode 32 of our podcast.
Why should consumers care about regenerative agriculture? Can't they just go buy their potatoes and continue with their lives?
Yeah, they can, I guess. Yeah, but I don't know how long our lives will continue if we do that.
Okay.
I think it's the same, in a way, it's, the same kind of as the research and the time that people put into finding the best product of whatever else, yet we feel like food is just, it's all equivalent, or it's just a matter of nutrients and calories that we're putting into our body or whatever, whereas we're able to spend like hours researching, some piece of furniture that we want to put into our house, including obviously how it will look, but also who made it and where we're going to get it and what either store or artisan is going to get our money and why. And so I think it's the same. We just have to come to the realization, and I think a lot of people have, that the money that we're putting into food is also about the money that we're putting into our communities and into the environment, or just that it has a way bigger potential impact than just giving our money to multinational corporations and being okay with just the calorie count in our diet or whatever.
Yeah, and a follow-up question to that is, why should consumers support agriculture producers that are practicing regen ag with like transition, or at least trying to do it?
It's really costly to grow food. It's costly, definitely, like the just in terms of like accounting lines and budgeting lines, but it can also be costly on health and mental health, and it's tempting, and I think that's the hoops that farmers have been asked or pushed to jump through, to just like cut those costs to a very, very minimum and make food as cheaply as possible. And that's part of the reason that we're facing the crises that we're facing now, both the farm debt crisis, where there's so much of the dollar that's not staying on the farm, and the climate crisis, where we're just producing food as just like trying to do what it seems like consumers have wanted, producing the cheapest food possible, sacrificing humans in the form of low wages and sacrificing land in the form of just abuse and cash crop after cash crop after cash crop, sacrificing the biodiversity for one of farms. And now we're realizing that maybe there's some consumers that don't want that, or that we didn't realize what kind of impact asking farmers to grow food cheaply would have on so many different aspects of our communities and of the world, that it seems like now we're putting the potential burden of solving climate change again onto farmers, and of saying, now you have to produce food, but also keep soils or regenerate soils and keep them healthy, and also create good jobs for your communities, and also give us provide organic food that contributes to the health of the entire community and world. So if that's what we're asking, and if we're serious about that, then we clearly are going to need like massive forms of support to farms for them to do that. And so not only in the form of people buying products that they think is representative of what we need for the world, but that's somewhere to start for consumers, I guess.
A report released by the National Farmers Union in 2020 found that between 1985 and 2018, agriculture expenses consumed 95% of agriculture revenue in Canada. So it left about 5% for the actual agriculture producer. One of the arguments for transitioning to regenerative agriculture is that a greater percentage of that revenue should be able to stay on farm, because an agriculture producer has less to buy in terms of inputs. Blake Vince of Merlin, Ontario, who we heard from in part 3, he mentioned the decreases in his operating costs put less pressure on him to come up with massive yields. For quite a few agriculture producers, making up for that lack of net income means going into debt or having an off-farm job to subsidize their farming habits. According to Statistics Canada, off-farm income accounted for 60% of total income of farm families in 2020. So you could be thinking at this point, if agriculture producers aren't netting that much, they're going into debt, they're having to do off-farm work, and regenerative agriculture is supposed to help address all three of these things, why aren't all producers switching over to regenerative agriculture today? Remember, transitioning from the way of farming and ranching that has dominated North America since the end of the Second World War to a regenerative system is not like flicking a light switch. It takes time. In the case of the 3 producers we heard from in part 1, 2, and 3 of the series, or what I like to call book 1 of the Stories of Regeneration series, it took like 15 to 20 years of going down the regenerative path to start seeing some results. As Rébeka said, producers are going to need support to make this transition. And right now in Canada, the main source of financial support for transitioning over to regenerative agriculture or agricultural climate solutions, which are two extremely similar systems. The main source of financial support is something called the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, or OFCAF. It's been around since 2022, so relatively new, and it's a program that agriculture producers can apply to cover some of the costs involved in adopting agricultural climate solutions. I'd say it's a good start for sure. I'm just not too sure what's going to happen to the program. I know in Alberta it's fully subscribed, and I'm not too sure what's going to happen with further years of OFCAF. If we want this change in our agriculture sector, producers are going to need more help from us.
Well, we were talking about like regenerative agriculture as an important term that, you know, has a lot of principles behind it, but that may or may not just become another term that is more or less meaningless or eventually co-opted by multinational corporations. I think organic agriculture was meant to have, or certainly was intended by some people to have, way more value in terms of like the social and community aspects of what we thought organic agriculture represented, and now we're realizing that it's really just like the label and the very basic set of standards, and that may or may not be what will happen with regenerative agriculture. So I don't think that we can look for like, or it wouldn't be an advancement if we're to say we now just have regenerative agriculture stickers on some of the food in our large chain grocery stores, but we're still not able to talk to those farmers or know what that actually means, that it's regenerative. So even though it's more work and even though it's less convenient, I think that it's pretty important to have the chance to talk to farmers. You know, maybe you're not asking them like super in-depth questions about cover crops or animal management or whatever, but at least to know that you could, or that you have the opportunity, or that there's an openness or interest to have a conversation with the farmers from which you're buying. In addition to the fact that when you're buying from a large grocery store, there's very little of that money that's actually going to farmers, whereas when you're buying it directly from farmers, there's a lot more of the dollar that they're able to retain. Clearly not enough of it, but also some of the money that they're not retaining is going to other businesses in their community or in your community. So definitely how people purchase food, but politically, like I said, if we're really asking farmers to help mitigate climate change, well, we're going to need a lot more support for farms, whether that's in the form of research, but also in the form of financial support and applied research that's really on farm and farmer driven and peer connected, or, you know, just ways for that information to circulate within networks of farmers. And I don't know about elsewhere in Canada, but I have a feeling we're not that different, or other provinces and regions are not that different from New Brunswick, where we're still very far from like even our Department of Agriculture being concerned about food sovereignty, and that there is no mission to actually grow food for New Brunswickers. It's an export-driven market where the intention is to grow the GDP. So if we don't see those political changes and visions, then, and you know, if we don't connect farming and the agriculture and the Department of Agriculture to Department of Environment, or, you know, then we're not, it's kind of just like blanket statements or whatever of like farmers are going to support climate change or whatever. Hopefully also talking less about the opportunities of climate change and even adaptation, which is obviously important, but talking about mitigation, and but not just talking, but actually putting our money where our mouth is, and seeing what actual changes can happen when we put the resources to it.
When I hear producers like Rébeka talk like that, it makes me feel like they're farming in a way that, well, they feel handcuffed, that they'd love to do more to regenerate the land, ecosystems, communities, even people, but they really can't because of financial restraints and demands from the markets. So obviously my brain does that thing where it spirals and begins to wonder, what happens if we take those handcuffs off?
Why do you care about regenerative agriculture? Why are you doing this?
Some days I'm not so sure about why, not necessarily why I'm farming. I mean, most days I'm pretty sure and feel pretty lucky to be doing this. But I know I wouldn't be farming other than, you could say, regeneratively. And like I said, I know that we're not doing everything that we know we could do, and we're definitely not ticking all of the boxes, even with the many principles of regeneration. But although sometimes I say that I would like to be like a public servant farmer, just in the sense that it would be cool if farming was actually like a public service, or if we're so far from that. But like, if you were seen as, in the same way as a teacher or a nurse, or as something that you're doing for the common good, and that I would like to be a farmer for like a hospital or something like that. I still think that I would need the kind of connection that comes with direct marketing, just of like seeing where your food is going and how it's being used and appreciated. And I think that gives it a lot of meaning, but doesn't mean that I would need to run a CSA or do everything to actually market and sell each vegetable. But that connection of knowing people, I think, makes it like you really have to be able to stand behind what you're growing. And it's not always the nicest aesthetically, and often it is, but that at least it's the best that you can do, or the safest that you could do, or that you feel like you would eat that right out of the field. So I don't think I would be able to farm more conventionally and know the people that are eating and consuming and feel 100% good about that.
Isn't that the type of farmer you'd want to buy your food from? Thank you for listening to part 4 of Stories of Regeneration. We've got more great stories from Canada's regenerative agriculture farmers and ranchers coming your way soon. Rural Roots to Climate Solutions is an Alberta-based organization empowering agriculture producers and the communities they live in with climate solutions. Rural Roots runs workshops, farm field days, webinars, and participant-driven projects like the Regenerative Agriculture Lab and the Siksikaitsitapi Agriculture Project. We produce a farmer's blog, and of course, we do this podcast. For more information about us and what we do, go to the website, which is www.rr2cs.ca. The rest of the amazing and talented Rural Roots to Climate Solutions team is Cheyenne Younger, Kristen Mountain, Shelley Seed, Lance Tailfeathers, Susan Solway, and Aidan Grind. The podcast is funded by a variety of Alberta-based funders and funders based in other parts of Canada. The Stories of Regeneration project is primarily funded by Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada. The project is led by a great organization called Regeneration Canada, a not-for-profit organization that advocates for soil health to mitigate climate change and guarantee a healthy food system, an organization Rural Roots is proud to partner with. For additional information, videos, blog posts, and digital materials about the agriculture producers featured throughout the series, visit regenerationcanada.com. And a big shout out to the Regeneration Canada team, so Antonius, Sarah, Ali, and Paige, and the film crew, Jean-Marc, Phil, and Obed, who worked very, very hard to bring this project to life. The interview with Rébeka took place in the traditional unceded territory of the Maliseet and the Mi'kmaq peoples. My parts of the episode were recorded on Treaty 7 lands and in the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Happy farming wherever in the world you are. And remember, what's good for the climate is good for the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM at the University of Guelph or via podcast. And thanks to Regeneration Canada and Rural Roots for Climate Solutions for permission to broadcast this episode. Please join us again next time for another episode of Food Farm Talk.